I'm very pleased to introduce Torbjørn Wisløff. How did I do? Is that approximately right? Okay. I have known Torbjørn for quite a few years. He's been a regular attender at SMDM. He's kind of hard to miss. As you'll see, he's quite tall. And he's very visible at SMDM meetings. I've known him for many years. He's been here at THETA once before, I believe. He's trained as a biostatistician originally, but is a very prolific and now very well-known health economic modeler in Norway. He works as a senior scientist in the infectious diseases, epidemiology, and modeling at the Norwegian Institute for Public Health. And he is also an associate professor in the Department of Health Management and Health Economics at the University of Oslo. And he is going to be talking to us about some of the work that he's done in hepatitis C.
Thank you. I thought that I just would have a few slides in the beginning to tell a little bit more about myself. Murray already did part of that introduction. So I've been trained only from the University of Oslo, first as a biostatistician and then with a PhD in health economic modeling. And I've been working at different institutions in Norwegian setting, both the Norwegian Center for Health Technology Assessment and Norwegian Knowledge Center for Health Services. And these two organizations were the main HTA agencies in Norway, and they've now been merged into the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, where I'm at present. As has been said, I also have a part-time position at the University of Oslo. And I've been working a few years at the hospital doing projects with
the disruption to the paging service has now been resolved. Regular paging procedures can now resume.
Yeah.
Your attention, please. The disruption to the paging service has now been resolved. Regular paging procedures can now resume.
I've been mainly working with health economic evaluations, but I've also done several meta-analyses. I've been working on survival analysis a while ago. And of course, within health economic evaluations, there is Markov models and Monte Carlo simulations that are kind of the main things that I've been working on there. And I've also done several advising stuff for PhD students, master students, and so on. Yeah. My institution has about 1,000 employees. It's a governmental research institution. HTA is one of these things that we do here. We also work on different topics related to vaccines and infectious diseases. There's a separate epidemiology division and some people working on registries, environmental research, and global something. I don't know them too much, but I've been helping them also a little bit with statistics and health economics. This is one of our buildings. It's a combination of different old and older buildings. And I have an office. My office is on the top here in the kind of, it looks like a tower when you're walking up the stairs, so I'm kind of sitting on top of it there, looking out over the rest of the gray buildings. Yes, this is kind of how the organization is set up. This is our boss on the top, and we are divided into 4 divisions. And I'm in the division of infectious diseases down there, and there are a lot of bosses in each of these divisions. But I'm just having a picture of the 2 kind of most important for this project. So the one above my small face there is my boss, and the other face to the right of her, that's the kind of boss that is responsible for this project on hepatitis C. And just a short kind of information on the project. The project, I think, is kind of initiated both by the woman at the right there, Hilde Kløvstad, and the woman on top, Camilla Stoltenberg. She has kind of some personal interest to this because her sister was an injecting drug user. She died a few years ago. So for her, this project has been very important. So that brings me over to the project. As mentioned, hepatitis C is a disease mainly among injecting drug users. So the injecting drug users in Norway, 40 to 50% of them have hepatitis C. And then there are also previous injecting drug users that have hepatitis C. In total, it's about 20,000 in Norway. That's about 0.5% of the population. And 85% of these are due to injecting drugs. So that it transmits when you share different user equipment like needles, syringes, and so on. And here's just a short introduction to the consequences of hepatitis C. You can get liver failure or you can get liver cancer. That's kind of the two main things that can happen. Of course, these can also lead to death. So our overall goal for this project is to reduce the incidence and burden of hepatitis C among people who are either injecting drugs now or who has done so in the past. And as a kind of back story for this, WHO have said that one of the targets is that all countries should reduce incidence of hepatitis C with 90% by 2030. And reduce the mortality by 65%. So we will try to look at whether we can reach these targets in Norway by simulating hepatitis C. So this is the group. It's a group of people with very different backgrounds. Hilde Kløvstad, who is kind of leading the project. She's a nurse. Richard White and Hinta Meyrink, they are kind of those who have developed the model in the beginning. Olav Dalgaard is the doctor on the project. Yes. So the treatment for hepatitis C has previously been drugs with severe side effects, and then it's been mainly given to those who have complications. Now, at least the past 3, perhaps 4 years, there's been new drugs available that are both better and have less side effects, and it's said that these completely eradicate the disease. But these drugs are also very expensive, so that brings in the health economic perspective. So the new drugs, they're very expensive. This picture is from a protest at the liver disease meeting in Barcelona some years ago. People were protesting against the high prices of these drugs. It's been said that these drugs can exhaust the whole healthcare budget, or at least the drugs budget. And we have examples of this from different places, like from prisons in the US. It's been said, and other media in the US have said the same, that these drugs are too expensive. Here also quote from Germany. So for this project, first we wanted to see, are these drugs cost effective? And then we also wanted to look at harm reduction initiatives and screening for positive hepatitis C cases. And then we also, in the end, looked at kind of what the implications on the long term. So this is then divided into 4 research questions. First, what's the cost effectiveness of these new drugs compared to the older drugs that have these terrible side effects? And then what's the cost effectiveness of screening alternatives and other targeted interventions to reduce hepatitis C? And then finally, we evaluated the drug expenditure of treating all newly diagnosed hepatitis C patients. So the first goal, and these are a bit busy slides perhaps, so I divided this into results for each genotype. First, genotype 1. Here you can see typical cost effectiveness plane, incremental qualities on the x-axis and incremental cost on the y-axis. And you see the different combinations of drugs plotted in the graph. And those that are below these lines would be typically regarded as cost effective. The highest of these lines is the assumed willingness to pay for Norway. So that's the limit that the government is typically assuming when they are introducing new drugs. But there has also been some calculations regarding what is displaced when you use money to fund new drugs, and it seems like this threshold is actually a bit lower. But for the analysis, I will stick to the highest of these thresholds. You can see here that there are some dots that are below the line, and these would typically be regarded as cost effective, and then we will try to find out what is the most cost effective of these. So here's a table only of the 2 that were below the line, and then the first one with the cost effectiveness ratio compared to current treatment, and then the third compared to the one above. And if you assume a Norwegian threshold of 75,000 euros per quality, then the first is cost effective, but the second is not. And then if we switch to the genotypes 2 and 3, you similarly see here that there are cost effectiveness of about 60,000, which is below the Norwegian threshold. So in conclusion, for these drugs, for each genotype, there are new drugs that are cost effective compared to the old treatment. And then secondly, now that we know that these are cost effective, what's the cost effectiveness of the screening alternatives? Yes?
Is it cost effective to treat everyone? But like the assumption was the population would be everyone with a hepatitis C diagnosis. What would be the population?
Okay. Everyone that is diagnosed with hepatitis C population in the head.
Okay.
We also did separate analysis for those that had developed disease like cirrhosis, and then it was even more cost effective. I think that's a good question related to the next slide actually, because here you see kind of if we want to find people with hepatitis C, we would have to look at different places. So we would have to look at both those that are injecting now and those who have been injecting earlier, who don't know they have hepatitis C and haven't developed the disease yet. If you were to look for those who have been injecting, one thing is to screen then at the GP office, where the general practitioner would ask questions to try to identify persons and then test these persons. And if you would want to look for those who inject drugs now, one thing is to look at addiction treatment institutions. That's one place to screen for injecting drug users who may have hepatitis C. Yes, and previously the guidelines said treat those that have cirrhosis, but that's just a subgroup of all with hepatitis C. So all of these are potentially eligible for treatment, and we have also now found that it's cost effective also for this big group of patients. So here is the results first on the incidence. So the red line on top is assumed a current strategy. So the current estimates based on what we've seen so far in the past years is that the incidence will decrease. But then if we screen at the GP office, or we screen among the injecting drug users at the clinics, we will see almost no effect, unless and that's if we base our treatment rule on that we only treat those who have cirrhosis like we did before. But if we also expand that to include everyone with hepatitis C, we see that the incidence, that's what we need to do to make the incidence really decrease even more. So the most effective strategy here is to screen at GP offices and combine that with treating off.
And what happens if you combine the screening at the GP and the PWID?
That we didn't do here, no.
So generally in Norway, do people who inject drugs regularly visit their GPs?
No, the GPs is for those who have injected before. But I think I've seen a study, I don't remember the number, but I think it's more than 50% of Norwegians visit their GP during 1 year. Approximately, yeah, a little bit more than 50%, I think. So it's, you would get quite a few of these. I think we had that number in as a parameter in the model, but I don't remember the details about that. Yeah. Yes. And then if we look at the cost effectiveness, if we only try these screening alternatives without treating all, then we find that these are not cost effective. But if we treat all as well, then we find that this most effective screening at GP offices for those who have been injecting before and treat all, we find is cost effective alternative. And if you want to see, so these are the results as an ICER. These are a bit difficult to compare when you have a lot of results. So that's why I usually switch to incremental net health benefit. Then it's easier to see that the highest number is the most cost-effective alternative. So in conclusion, these screening alternatives seem to be cost-effective and reduce the incidence of hepatitis C. But no single or combination that we tested could reach the WHO goal of 90% reduction. We got to 60% at the best estimate here. And then the third aim was to look at other targeted interventions to reduce the spread of hepatitis C. Here we have identified two interventions. First, a clean needle and syringe program, because that is kind of where transmission happens. there is a program already. So what we looked at here was increasing that program. And there is also an opioid substitution program, either drinking or by, if you use heroin, you can switch to smoking it instead of injecting it. And then, of course, there will not be any sharing of the equipment. So these are results in terms of incidence. Here you see the reduction comes at once for each of these alternatives, and if you look at the combination, that's even better. Yes.
So there are two populations in my understanding: the ones that the past users and the ones that are the current users. And this focuses on the current users.
Yes.
Right. So how can you have a 70% reduction on incidence? That's it. So I mean, and can you combine the two benefits in a way? Can you have two interventions? Kind of a similar question like before. Can you have two interventions that they?
Yeah. So here we included the combination of these two. So both the needle and syringe program and the opioid substitution program.
No, I meant like with respect to the
with the screening
alternative screen the past users, because this is only going to be for the current users.
We have not done that. No.
Okay.
So these harm reduction initiatives, if you look at the cost effectiveness, they are both cost effective separately, and the combination is also cost effective. And if you want to kind of find the most cost effective, you switch to net health benefit, and you find that the combination has the highest net health benefit. In conclusion, the harm reduction initiative seems to be cost effective and reduce the incidence. And as before, no single or combination of interventions in this group was able to reach the 90% reduction, but here we came to 80% approximately.
So that's sorry. So if you have the screening for Hep C and you have the two programs together, it's still not 90. That's where you're getting the 80% if you combine both.
No, this is only the combination of these. So if we had combined all of them, we might have gone to 90%. Yes. Because we didn't do that analysis of the combination. But I think we would be much closer to 90%. Yeah.
It'd be that you were above 100%. It seems like there were a lot of benefits in both. So yeah.
60% in one and 80% the other.
But as you see here, for instance, there's a big gain of each of these. Oh, I shouldn't touch it. There's a big gain of each of them, but when you combine it, the extra gain there is not very much. So, yeah.
I mean, those seem like very optimistic estimates of the potential benefit. I mean, it seems to me that many people who are injecting drugs will not participate in needle and syringe programs and will not participate in opioid substitution therapy. And I just wonder what assumptions you've made about the willingness to participate in these programs and adherence and so on. But I mean, you can only reach that if almost everyone is participating in these programs, I would think, because that's a very substantial reduction.
Yeah. Of course, it's a combination of both the assumed effectiveness itself, but also the adherence to the program.
But do you remember what proportion of new injection drug users would be participating in these things in the model, or is that not sure?
I think for one of these we assumed 50%, but I don't remember which of them, or whether it was both. I'm not sure. Yeah, but I'm coming back to some of the input data in the end. Yes, we were here. Yes, And here, if you compare all these together, so as I said, we didn't combine them, but we have kind of ordered them in the cost effectiveness plane so that you can see kind of the difference between the screening and the harm reduction alternatives, both in terms of effectiveness on the x-axis and in terms of the total costs on the y-axis. So you can clearly see that it's this harm reduction initiative that at least our model thinks that is the best of these. And then finally, we looked at the drug expenditure for the period up to 2030. There's been a slowly increasing number of users since 2004, as you can see here. And then after these new drugs with less side effects were introduced, there was a very steep increase in number of users. But what then about the expenditure? You can see that the first years after the drugs were introduced, even before the major bump in number treated, the expenditure was really skyrocketing. And then what happened? You would expect that because these number of users were increasing even more, that the expenditure would go through the roof, but that was not what happened. Because in 2016 in Norway, we introduced these negotiations of the prices. And hepatitis C drugs were the first in this new system of negotiations. It was made publicly official of all the rebates that were given in this tender process, and it was up to 60% reduction. Yeah, 50% reduction. Yeah. So the pharma companies, they complained about this, and after that, it's not been official how much these rebates are. And then this is what happened to the annual expenditure instead. It actually decreased by 14% the coming 2 years, although the increase in number of treated was 89%. So that's pretty impressive. Here I've looked at just how this is divided between the different drugs, just to show how dynamic the system is. Both because the doctors would typically recommend and start treating with the new types of drugs, but also because these drugs are typically used for between 12 and 48 weeks. So when there's a new patient, the doctor would typically start on a new treatment if he thinks that's a better treatment. And then also these price reductions had an implication on some of these. I think it was the brown one here that had the 50% reduction, if I'm not remembering wrong. So
you're saying some of the DAAs are used for 48 weeks, or you're including the previous?
The previous as well, yeah. Yes. So to look at prices in the future, we used the same model that we had already used. I will go into more details about that later. And we also combined that with data from the prescription registry on estimated number of patients. So here is what we expect with regards to treated hepatitis C patients in the future. And that if we assume the same prices and rebates that was negotiated in 2016, we would expect the drug expenditure to kind of have the same slope. And if you combine that with what we have seen previously, it looks like this with a steep increase after new drugs were introduced, and then a decrease after the price negotiations. Of course, it would be interesting to see whether this actually happens in the future. Yes?
Do you know to what extent the current hepatitis C population has been treated, and whether you need to extend to population that has not been yet diagnosed with hepatitis C? Like existing hepatitis C patients would probably have reached out for treatment. Has this been already paid for, you think, in Norway? Or are there people that they have hepatitis C, but they have no access to treatment yet?
There are a lot of patients that have been diagnosed, and there has been some discussions regarding what we're going to do about that. Because, as you say, before, people would only get treatment if they already had cirrhosis. And if you look into some databases in Norway, you would find out that some people have been diagnosed with hepatitis C, but not gotten treatment. So that's one of the questions, what are we going to do about that? Because typically I think it's partly also an ethical problem. It is kind of whether it's legal to go into those databases and find the patients that have been diagnosed with hepatitis C and then send them an email or whatever to say that, okay, you have hepatitis C, you can now get treatment for it. I'm not sure whether the government would approve that kind of project, but we have been discussing what to do about that. Yes.
Related to that, so currently you have no screening program, is that right?
Yeah, no screening program.
No screening program whatsoever. And I think the other question I had was around immigrants. So you talk about the person who inject drugs and of former current users. And what about immigrants? That's not a problem in Norway.
I think that's as I said in the beginning, 85% of the hepatitis C cases in Norway are due to injecting drugs. And I guess the remaining 15 is primarily due to immigrants. So I don't know what's going to happen in that part. This whole project is mainly focusing on the injecting drug users. So, yeah. But I know that there is a screening program for different diseases when people enter the country, like tuberculosis and so on. I don't know whether hepatitis C is part of that. I don't know. I don't know all the details. But, yes. So the conclusion on this project was that the incidence is projected to decrease in the next years. And one reason of it is that increased uptake of drugs eradicates the disease among those who are treated. And both the empirical and the simulation data indicate that the cost of these drugs actually has reached its maximum. Of course, this will depend a lot on whether we introduce different screening alternatives and so on. So, yeah. And then I have some slides at the end on kind of how we got there and about the model, because that's typically a lot of the questions that come at the end. So I'll take that in the end. First of all, the model itself, it's looking at those infected, those who are infected influence the future number of infected. So it's a compartmental model. It was originally developed by Richard White and Hinta Meyerink in collaboration with a few others. I think I have, yeah. And it has been calibrated against Norwegian data. In the analysis I've shown you here, we have kind of two sets of simulations. First, we simulate all the input parameters, and then we simulate the model itself with infections and development of disease. So here is a simplified structure of the model. People are typically not infected or have hepatitis C, and then they can move on to get liver failure or liver cancer. And then if they have a transplant, then they can kind of go back to being not infected. And then if they get treatment, they can kind of also go back. Yes. So, as I said, we are doing simulations on the model, and all the parameters that are uncertain, we simulate those. And then we run the disease model to get incidence and prevalence over time. We weight in the health-related quality of life in all the different disease stages, and then calculate the costs in each health state. And regarding the evidence for the drugs, these are based on the CADET report. Here are some relative risks that we derived from that report for each of the new drug combinations compared to the older drug combination. And then for these screening and harm reduction initiatives, we had actually more. We wanted more to evaluate more interventions than we actually did. So here are the sources of those that we found evidence for. Yes, and then we did some combinations of some of this. And when we chose which of these interventions to evaluate, we based it on kind of a simplified version of the evidence pyramid. You're probably all familiar with the different versions of this, and we had to decide where to set the limit, because when you compare all these different alternatives to each other, it would kind of not be fair if data from on one intervention was based on a systematic review of several RCTs, and the other was based on kind of a small cross-sectional study or something like that. So we had to find a kind of a limit, and we set that at that place. So we said that if we have at least one RCT or we have systematic review of cohort studies, then that's kind of our level of evidence. And if we go below that, like for instance one cohort study, we will not evaluate the cost effectiveness of an intervention with that kind of input data. So that's why we had to exclude two of the interventions we wanted to look at, because it was data based on only one cohort or based on only a control arm from one randomized control trial. And here are some more data on input. Here are the rebates that were given and made publicly available. These are rebates from 2016.
We have a question from the online
audience.
So the question is, how is incidence modeled as a function of prevalence?
That's a difficult question because that's details from the first publication that I was not part of. So I don't know all the details about that. Yeah, but I have a reference at the end, and I will direct people to that reference. Yeah. So after this, there has been new. There is now kind of a competition each year to get. So the rebates will not be the same in future years. And here is just if you calculate the price per cure based on, because the numbers you see on the right there are related to how long, how many weeks they get the treatment of each of the drugs. So From this table, you could almost kind of guess which combination that would be most cost effective just based on the effect that we put in and the price of the cure. Because if you, for instance, look at the effects here that are almost 2, and these prices that are the lowest, you would kind of guess that these would kind of win the competition. And then regarding the simulations, for those that are not familiar with the process, this is just an example of one of the inputs. We had, I think it was 99 different parameters that we were simulating. So here, one of the input parameters is probability of acute HIV or hepatitis C infection, and that acute infection would become chronic. The probability of 0.747, and then we include that as a beta distribution, and if you have 1,000 iterations of that one, you would get something like this. And we did that for all of the input parameters. So we did that kind of 99 times, and then ran the model for each of these. And based on that, we calculated the cost effectiveness acceptability curves. Here for the drugs, genotype 1, 2, and 3. And you will typically see that for all of these, there is one of the combinations is cost effective if you assume the threshold I mentioned of 75,000, like here. But if we rather would have used the kind of opportunity cost idea, what is displaced, then at least for genotype 2 and 3, it would not be cost effective actually to use these new drugs. Yes?
Just want to ask, how much would it be US dollar related to 75?
All these are in euros,
Yeah.
so in US dollars you would multiply by 0.8 or something. Or divide by
$50,000. So
something like that, or
it's 1.4.
6, where is the other way around?
Yeah.
All the way. Yeah, so it would be not 75 would be about 90, I think. Yeah.
So that in your the first slides you showed, you seem to indicate that even for the opportunity cost threshold, you would still have some of the treatments that they would be cost effective.
Yes, that's that's genotype 1 I showed on that graph. But 2 and 3 would probably not be cost effective if you use them. Yeah. And that's somehow related also to, you see the effect estimates here are much bigger for genotype 1. Yes?
One more question from online audience. Has compliance with the medication regimen been incorporated as a variable into the model?
Like it's one of the 99 parameters.
I don't remember actually. Perhaps we forgot that this time. I'm not sure. I usually try to remember that, but I'm not sure whether we did that. Yeah. Yes. And here are also results on uncertainty for the screening alternatives. Here you see that if you assume, regardless of what you assume, the combination of screening at GP offices and treating all positive cases is cost effective. And then if you look at the harm reduction initiatives, it's the combination that is clearly cost effective regardless of all your thresholds. And then finally, just a few things about kind of what we did recently. If you look at the publications, there's been a few publications in this area, and one of the things that we did, and also Cadet did, as far as I know, but several others have not, that including the relative effects of the treatment. Because that's usually standard in economic evaluation, but in this case, a lot of people seem to have assumed that, for instance, 95% or 100%, whatever was reported in the trial for the treatment arm is what they would expect. But we used data on what's happening today and then multiplied by this relative effect. And that usually is more conservative estimates of the effect. Another thing we did was we performed simulations of these input parameters and then ran the model. It's a bit time consuming, even in R. And analysis of screening and harm reduction initiatives was exclusively based on evidence. As I said, we had our own threshold of what we based the evidence on. And these types of analysis are usually more based on the assumption, some kind of assumption on what will happen if you screen or introduce harm reduction initiatives. And this projection of the budget implications, I've not seen that before, at least not recently, including the reduction in drug expenditure based on price negotiations. And then finally, there's always a lot of limitations. I think perhaps the major this time is the effect of the interventions. Neither the drugs nor the other alternatives have kind of a level of evidence that you would expect. At least I've done several models in cardiovascular disease and so on, and there you're used to either that the trials are kind of 20,000 patients, or that it's a systematic review of 5 or 10 trials and so on. And we're not even close to that in this area. Yes, and this is just to summarize some of the input data, in case I forgot. Yes, and finally the references. Yeah. Thank you. Are there any more questions? Yes.
So you said that nearly all the people who are infected with hepatitis C in Norway at present are injection drug users.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering if that's really true. When we have looked a little harder, we found that the prevalence among people who have immigrated from other countries is actually surprisingly high.
Mm-hmm.
And then, at least in Canada, a minority of people who are infected are people who got it through the blood supply years ago, before we were screening. So in Canada, after 1990, we screened, but prior to that, if you got a transfusion, you've got a reasonable chance of getting hepatitis C through the blood supply. So I'm wondering if the epidemiology of Hep C in Norway is really all that different, because there are still some people alive, I would imagine, in Norway who got transfused prior to 1990.
I don't know all the details about that, but I've heard that should not be a problem in Norway. I don't know whether they started testing earlier or what they did, but I've heard that should not be a big problem. And I think the prevalence of hepatitis C among immigrants is probably about at the same level. But one of the differences is that Norway have very, very strict rules on number of immigrants that they allow each year. And so I think a lot of people are at the moment, or have always been, we have always have very strict rules on immigration. Like, for instance, Sweden, our neighboring country, they usually take 10 times as many immigrants every year. So it's very, very strict, actually.
Within your model, can I ask what happens if a drug user becomes reinfected?
do you treat them again, or do you leave them?
Yeah, he would treat them again, because then they would go into the they would go back to the not infected group, and then they can be infected again.
Do you have a sense of how often that might occur?
No, actually not. But as long as it's, I think that the model would be a simplification there, because then you would typically assume that they have the same risk as those who are not infected. So that's typically not it would not be a separate group if you are treated and go back to being not infected. Yeah.
I'm still not clear how, like, whether you model transmission. So this is the disease history, and then, like, especially with the people who inject drugs, where you would worry about transmission or reduction in transmission with the treatment. Like, that you have a transmission component to it, or how do you model that, or you just basically reduce the incidence? So this is the whole model, or there's a transmission model that is linked into this one?
I think you would say that this is the whole model, but as long as it's, yeah.
There has to be a transmission model. It has to predict the change in incidence. And
but that's my question.
I don't
or you could just say we do intervention A, and overall that reduces incidence by however proportion within a certain population, but then it's not really dynamic. So I think that's exactly.
Yeah, I think typically these models are said to be something in between. So I don't know all the details about that, but because I said that it was developed before I came to the institution, so I'm just kind of making the outer shell with simulating the other parameters, and then calling this model and adding the costs and qualities on top of that. So
there would be an Richard White paper, I guess.
That's the last one. So Richard White is kind of the main model developer here, I think, but he's the second author of all papers because he's not writing himself. So it's Hinta Meyerink's paper, that's the model development and burden of disease paper, and that's where you can find more details. And in that paper, and possibly also in some of mine, there's a link to the GitHub place where his model is made available. So, yeah.
Kind of on the last note, can you share what was your experience with posting the model online, open source? I mean, did you have people come back to you and ask questions about it, or do you feel that it increases transparency, or you have heard nothing?
So it's Richard White who has posted it on his GitHub place. So I didn't post on my shell there, but that's posted in at least one of the publications. I have added those files, I think, but not. But yeah, so it's kind of a combination of what I posted there. But I have not got any questions about what I posted at all. Yeah.
I think you touched on this, but I just want to be clear. Was there any look at whether people who inject drugs have a different level of access to medical care from the general population? Since you're saying almost everything is targeting people who inject drugs, so if they specifically have much poorer access to care in Norway, then that would impact on the results.
I guess that somehow depends on what you mean by access, because in Norway it's relatively kind of free, whatever you do. But I think they would typically not visit their own GP that often. If they have
that would impact the results, right?
Yeah, I think that would, yeah. But so that's kind of why we thought of, if we want to screen for these current injecting drug users, you would go to the treatment clinics because there you would be more certain to find them.
Right.
And you can also, there's also been some discussions on kind of approaching them kind of not on the street, but there are some of these I don't know, centers that help out on kind of a street level, if you see what I mean. And they would, you could also do something there, but it was difficult to find evidence for all these interventions. So that's kind of one of the main.
Another question from online audience.
Yes.
Is the infectious disease component of the model posted online as well?
Yeah, that would be part of this, the first paper, and then the GitHub that they refer to there. Yeah.
Would you have access to the GitHub space, or can we send that information to the interested people?
Oh yeah, we
Or
could
is
probably
it in
send
the
it's in the first paper and the second paper at least. I don't remember whether it's in the third, but at least the two first it's posted. Yeah. Was there anything else?
Okay, thank you very much. Stick around a little bit for if there's any other questions or discussion. So
thank you for showing up. And of course, it's a bit uncommon for me to know all the details about the model, because usually I do develop the model myself, but this time it's kind of based on someone else's work, so I don't know all the technical details down there, but thank you for coming.
Yes, yeah, online on the GitHub. Going to the GitHub. No, it's the fine. It's the fine. But
When I sent in the first papers here, that was the one on the drugs, I was not
oh yeah, I heard that you
right there. Because
I think you know
before I found this now I have to go. I never got the journal.
I know what I'm just bringing is a reason that everybody that that's why it's so
So that was, I think that one paper that you have from the day.
I don't know.
And I know you guys.
Also whether it's PDF or something like that.
yeah,
That was so helpful.
like where
That made me interested on that, yeah.
it's interesting because you don't really think about that.
I know, and I think like, I mean, actually, once I understood what I think that when you meant, I thought, wow, this is actually really cool.
No, but the concept is like from the
macroeconomic together. Yeah.
But then the question will make a difference.
So you're alright, but you're not.